Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to kind of build on some of the things that we've done with chunking the text and annotating and analyzing in order to find meaning. This will give you some additional strategies to add to the mix that might either replace those strategies or, as you're going to see here, kind of work alongside of them to create meaning or to find meaning. So these are all going to be graphic organizers. So what I did here was I took this poem, Invictus, and what I did first was I chunked it and highlighted it and annotated it in order to kind of pull out everything that I possibly could. So what I'm going to try to do throughout the course of this video is, through a combination of annotating, highlighting, chunking, and then using visualizations or graphic organizers, we'll find meaning in this poem. So if you want to pause the video to maybe read the poem, that would be a good way to sort of be on the same page with me here. You can pause now to do that. So in terms of chunking the text and what I did with it here before we get to the graphic organizers, so some of the things that I noticed, first of all, structurally, this is built as in terms of quatrains. Those are 4-line stanzas with an A-B rhyme scheme. This is actually called heroic stanzas that are built that way, and I think the heroic stanza kind of speaks to some of the meaning that's being conveyed here, so we'll come back to that later. But I chunked it by stanza, so a lot of them kind of convey a similar meaning that all kind of come together, but different situations for each stanza. So the first one is kind of about this everlasting dark night, but then in the end, he kind of affirms that he has this unconquerable soul in the face of that dark night. The second stanza is about this brutal, painful situation, but he confronts it unbowed. The third stanza, it presents us with this anticipation of horrors for potentially years to come, but he's confronting it unafraid. And then in the final stanza, kind of reinforces what's been built so far by establishing that it doesn't matter whether the straight toward the gate is narrow, or that there are punishments going to be placed on us, or that are going to be inflicted upon us. He reaffirms that he is the master of his fate and the captain of his soul. So throughout the poem, I see that there's this kind of like back and forth between the terrible things that are going on, usually in the first half of the stanza, and then the affirmation in the second half of the stanza about him being unafraid or unbowed or unconquerable, and in the end, the captain of his soul. So it seems like he's confronting these challenges that he faces, aware of what they are, but also unafraid to meet the potential of death. So within each chunk, I highlighted sort of that back and forth. The blue is kind of the bad stuff, and then the green is that positive thing that's happening within him. So that was how I chunked the text. I haven't arrived at any sort of theme yet. All of the graphics that we'll see are intended to lead us towards some theme. So we'll move on to those. So first here, we have these names that I'm giving them are kind of my own. You can give them your own as well if you don't like these, but I'm calling it the box plus one. So there's obviously, it's a box that it's broken up into 4 boxes, and plus 1 in the middle, which is the theme. So the way that the box plus 1 works is each of the four boxes within the larger box kind of represent different things that might be going on in your thought process as you try to arrive at theme. So you don't have to do them in the order that they're in, any particular order, but I would probably start with the top left, which is just what do I think and feel, which would kind of be like my initial reaction. So if like one of the things that I felt when I read this poem was that I was inspired, because it's a pretty inspiring poem, I would just write that. I could write any of my initial reactions there. It's a poem that's about the difficulty of overcoming struggle, and I'd probably just write all of the things that come to mind. I mean, it's kind of just like, I mean, it's informal, so I could write as many things there as I want. And that doesn't mean that those things that I thought or felt necessarily are what the theme of the poem is about. But if, I'm going to trust myself that if I'm a good reader, that I have a pretty good eye for, for language, and that I'm going through this process responsibly, that maybe my thoughts and feelings have something to do with the theme. So it might be just a place to start. And then I could kind of like check myself and how confident I am in my abilities at the end. And if my initial thoughts and feelings kind of line up with the theme that I eventually find, that tells me that, my instinct is a good one. So next, rhetorical and or structural choices that are being made. I identified that heroic structure. I identified sort of that back and forth nature of those like different sets of feelings within each stanza, where there is sort of like a negative part and then a positive part, showing like the war that's going on in the world that he lives in and within himself probably as well. Rhetorical choices. I could record any of if there's any sort of figurative language. I can make note of all of those things up here. So I'm kind of like separating out the different ways that I might look at this poem from a language and structure perspective, like my personal perspective. And now here, once I've looked at the language, once I've looked at structure, I can start to look at what ideas are kind of coming forth. I'm starting to see that this is a poem about, it's about struggle, and it's about overcoming it. It's about personal strength and what one has to kind of tell oneself in order to overcome those struggles, and how sort of approaching a struggle with a certain mindset or attitude might help me to overcome it. So that's kind of what I'm starting to see come out. What questions are being asked? What questions do I have over here? So this is a place to look at both what questions the text might be asking us to think about, but also as I'm trying to make my way toward theme, do I have any questions left about the text that I might go back to the text and try to answer? So a question this text is asking is, what does it take to fight back against something that is trying to crush me? What does it take to overcome struggle? And perhaps if I realize that the text is asking that question, if I can figure out, does the text provide an answer to that question, then maybe that answer is actually going to be the theme. And I think that that's probably where I'd end up with a theme that has something to do with the fact that in order to overcome or at least confront great struggle, one must be aware of what the struggle is, and talk to oneself or convince oneself that they are capable and equipped to confront that struggle. So it's about the messages we send to ourselves and how we discuss struggle with ourselves and confront it with open eyes and with confidence, rather than backing down and being fearful of it. So all of that, everything I just said, I'd try to find a way to create a theme that kind of boils all of those ideas down. But I feel like having gone through this process here with the box plus one, I can probably come up with a theme based on identifying these things. Move on to another way of looking at it. This is called the 5 square. So there's 5 squares. In the middle, you're going to end up getting to theme. But it's sort of a restructuring of the last one, just giving you a different way to look at it. But some of the language here is a little bit different. So again, initial reactions. And I will say I'm writing my reactions and things within these boxes along the way. They don't have to be written necessarily. Like some people are, better at drawing, or you might be able to sketch out or doodle, the emotion that you felt while reading this poem. Like, this is this is my doodle of someone looking inspired, I don't know that that's a very good doodle. And that's why I would not doodle, because I'm not any sort of artist. But if you are, or even if you just feel like you're better at kind of like putting an emotion or a feeling or a thought down on paper by using an image rather than words, I think in this process you can do that, because these thoughts here are not anything that anyone's really going to ever read. It's not something you necessarily need to like turn in, and you're never going to be graded on your thought process, or at least the visualization of it. So do it in whatever way makes the most sense to you. So I would start probably initial reactions in the same way that I did the last one. I was inspired by this poem. I could write anything I want in this outer circle or outer box. Surface features are anything rhetorical. So if there's any figurative language, if I see imagery that stands out, if there's repetition, anything linguistic that I see going on, those are referred to sometimes as surface features. So that's where I would make note of those things. And, making note of those things when you're taking or when you're studying poetry, oftentimes those rhetorical devices or literary devices being used in the text are often going to be things that you might cite as examples when you go to write about it. So it's good to make note of those surface features. Structural features then, again, that would come back to like that heroic stanza structure. That does not look like the word heroic. But that, I think, the structure, the way that the poem is actually composed, I think this is a poem that has a heroic tone to it. It sounds like somebody who is like kind of like running into a fire, somebody who's not backing down from the potential for death or harm to be done. And this is a poem intended to inspire and make people feel like they can accomplish great things. So I think it's appropriate for it to be written with that stanzaic structure. So I could probably use that structural feature in discussing the overall tone and meaning of the poem. Rhetorical structure, now this is where I get to like that progression of ideas rather than the actual like physical structure, poetic structure. This is the idea structure. And I'd go back to my chunking here. This is where, the chunks come back into play. So I would personally not do something like a 5 square unless I had already looked at the text and chunked and annotated it. This will give me a way to kind of like focus my thoughts that lead toward a theme. So once I've looked at my initial reactions, all of these different features, the structure, that might lead me toward a theme, which I think would probably sound something like, again, what I did with the last one, something about how in order to confront struggle, we must do it with open eyes and without fear, in order to have a chance to persevere. Something along those lines. And then the last one here, this is the one that I kind of think I might like the most, or is the most interesting to me. But this is called hexagonal. It's obviously built on the idea of a hexagon here. And the concept here is that we want to show how things like fit together and link from one to the next. So I'll try to show you as best I can here how this method works. Excuse my handwriting on this screen, but I'll do my best. So, it doesn't really matter where I start amongst these hexagons. What I'm trying to show here is how whatever my first, or the first observation that I make about this poem Invictus can kind of lead to another thing. And hopefully, in the process of kind of like building off of kind of different sides of these hexagons, and I can create more. I can, just kind of like keep going and keep building meaning in different directions. But by kind of following the links between different parts of the poem, it might eventually lead me at some point toward meaning. So I'm going to start with the first thing that I noticed was that heroic structure. That is A, B, A, B, and it's written in quatrains. And then off of that, I'm going to think about like what is that structure? Does that structure serve any purpose? Well, I think that structure, one, it's very orderly. It reminds me of poems, even though this is not a very old poem. It kind of reminds me of like poems from like long ago. It reminds me of like people running into war, into battle. It's like a classical structure, and there's something like majestic about it. It's not, even though it's about struggle and years of darkness and being facing the pressures that come from oppression and war and prejudice and things like that. It's facing it with dignity. It's dignified. So I think that is heroic. That builds on the idea of heroicism. And now the next thing based on that I start asking is like that tone that comes from that type of structure. I think I can support that even further with the ideas that are in the poem. So in the first stanza, he talks about being unconquerable. In the second stanza, he talks about being like unbowed. Talks about being unafraid. And later, he talks about being the captain of his soul. So all of that language that's actually in the poem is support that I can use for this being sort of like this dignified, heroic rallying cry that he's passing on to people to confront their struggles and not back down. And as I study it further, I can talk about like the repetition of that kind of language that reaffirms that bravery in the face of struggle. And there's also the repetition of the kind of dark, the darkness that's faced throughout the course of the poem in different contexts. So the darkness, the despair. So that repetition of the back and forth between those things. And to illustrate that darkness, we see like there's the night in the first stanza, the clutch in the second stanza, the wrath in the third stanza, and the narrow strait in the fourth stanza. So the repetition of that set of ideas as well, reinforcing the struggle. Okay, so finally, like what this is kind of doing is what I'm seeing is the first thing I noticed was the structure. I used these words to kind of define how that structure creates a particular tone. I took that further to show how that tone is furthered or built, strengthened by this other language that appears in the poem. I asserted why he probably has that language there to build repetition and to start to build this idea of this strength and this persevering attitude that is balanced with this darkness, repetition of that's created by this language, and that reinforces the struggle that's being faced. So I think at that point I'm kind of ready to arrive at a theme. Like my path that I have walked from here, gone all the way around to here, is going to lead me to a theme again that asserts that in order to confront and face struggle, we must do it with open eyes and full hearts ready to confront that struggle. So whether you use this hexagonal method, which I might have illustrated that a bit sloppily, and I can probably build on that a little bit in class, or the other box methods, I think that these might give you a kind of a way to illustrate your thought process or to visualize it rather than having everything be text-based. So between chunking the text and using these graphic organizers, you might be able to see your thought process as you try to arrive, of course, at meaning. So thanks for paying attention.